appreciate you joining us today and taking time out of your day to listen to us and have a discussion about bringing it together, integrating academics and behavior, and thinking about intensive intervention. I'm just going to introduce this webinar. I'm going to talk a little bit about logistics and do some introductions in our agenda, and then I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful panelists to take it from there. So just some introductions about who's on the line with us. We're really lucky today to have three wonderful panelists with us. Dr. Erica Lembke is going to be starting us off today. She's an associate professor at Mizzou at the University of Missouri. She is one of our advisors and our coaches and consultants at the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Erica has worked in the field of special education for 19 years, and she has a wealth of expertise. She's going to be talking to you specifically about the integration of academics and behavior. And then following up with Erica is Nicole Bucka. She's an educational consultant that works with us at the National Center on Intensive Intervention, specifically through the state of Rhode Island and Technical Assistance Center there. Nicole is going to be presenting to you a case study that was done integrating academics and behavior specifically in intensive intervention and what that might look and feel like for those of you that are in the classroom and in the field doing that kind of work. And then following up with Erica, we have Dr. Gail Chan, who's a BCBA. She's a senior researcher at AIR and works at the National Center on Intensive Intervention with us. She's going to be going through some DVR progress monitoring, behavior progress monitoring tools for you, as well as some resources that we have for integrating behavior tools and progress monitoring on behavior. So the agenda for today is kind of what I just discussed. We're going to talk first about intensive intervention for students with behavioral and academic needs, what that means and how we conceptualize that at the National Center on Intensive Intervention. We're going to talk a bit about the integrated relationship between behavior and academics and how we don't believe that those often live in isolation from each other. We're going to present a case study on data-based individualization for behavior and academics, talk about some resources, and then have an opportunity to answer your questions and discussion. I see that many of you have already started answering or asking questions within the question box, so note that if you do have questions, feel free to go ahead and post them and we will do our best to answer them. We will also open it up towards the end and present some of those questions to the panelists as we have time to. We'll also do our very best to answer some of the questions that you posed when you registered for this webinar. Especially, we're going to do our best to focus on the questions that were posed that relate directly to the work and the focus of this webinar while we do our best to get to all of those as well. So if you have questions, feel free to post them in the question box and we'll do our best to get to you. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Dr. Lembke, and she's going to talk a bit about intensive intervention, behavior, and academics.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and I'm excited as well to be with you today. And so I'm going to give you a broad sense of NCII's approach to data-based individualization, and I'll continue to talk about that as DVI. And then I'm going to dig just a little bit deeper and talk a little bit about the intersection of behavior and academics. Certainly, that was on a lot of your minds today, I'm sure, as you registered for this webinar. It's certainly on the minds of a lot of teachers that I work with in schools, thinking about, especially we're in the first couple of months of school here, and you're probably seeing some of those intersections between behavior and academics. A little bit about the mission of the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and again, you can access more information at intensiveintervention.org. That website will be strung throughout the PowerPoint slides, but want to make sure you've got that right from the outset. The focus of NCII, or the mission, is to really think about helping support schools in implementing DVI in reading, in mathematics, and behavior. And the focus is really on those students who have the most challenging behavioral or academic needs. So following up on the mission of the National Center on Response to Intervention, the focus of NCII is to really narrow in and target and help support those students who have the greatest difficulties. And we'll talk in a minute about who those students might be. So why do we need intensive intervention? We know from the literature that even with validated programs, we encourage everyone to always use evidence-based programs or research-based programs. We know that even with those in effect, 3 to 5% of our students are still not being supported to the degree which we think they could be. And so we know that these students may need more practice, they may need content in a very different manner. As you're listening today, you might be reflecting on students that you have who have struggled maybe just this past couple months, but it could be that they have been struggling for a while, you know, across years, and you've tried many of the tricks that you have in your toolbox, and we're still not able to meet their needs. That's where intensive intervention comes in. We're really thinking about customizing programs for students based on the characteristics that they display. So who needs intensive intervention? When we think about the students who might fit the mold of students who fall into this category of, you know, those students, as I mentioned before, who are in need of our most specific behavioral and academic support. We're talking, one, about students with disabilities who are not making adequate progress. So certainly we might have students who are on IEPs right now, and for whatever reason, we're not seeing the growth from those students that we would have hoped. We also may have students in this group who have either or both low academic achievement or high intensity and high frequency behaviors. These students maybe have a disability that's identified in one area or another. Could be they have identified goals in both areas, but we have the students who are presenting with these challenging behaviors or really low academic needs. And we might also have students who have not been identified. The students I've talked about who are early in their careers, who are struggling, or students who have been in the system for quite some time who have not responded to the typical secondary intervention programs that we would have hoped. And so all of these students are students who we feel like are in need of intensive intervention, and we're going to speak more today about how to meet the needs of those students. So the approach that the National Center on Intensive Intervention uses, as I mentioned before, is DVI, or data-based individualization. And it really provides a program to help determine when to intervene and how to intervene. This really comes from work that was conducted at the University of Minnesota. Stan Dino and his colleagues there began this work in what they called database program modification, or DBPM, early in the 70s, and it's really continued since that time. It's a process or a framework. It's not, DVI is not a single intervention, but it's an approach to how we serve students, how we problem solve through their difficulties, and then how we come back and check that data to make sure that things are now, we hope, going well for the student, or if they aren't, how to intervene and keep going with that particular student. So this is the approach sort of characterized in a visual. If you think about that top sort of orange box, we think about first delivering that Tier 2 or validated intervention program that might be supplemental to core instruction, but something that's a standard protocol or secondary intervention. So if you think about students who are not responding to general classroom instruction, they may be getting some type of Tier 2, some type of supplementary intervention on top of their classroom instruction. And so we want to continue to think about how students are responding to that instruction first, and I would say also to core instruction prior to implementing this DVI approach. We want to make sure those pieces are really in place, strongly in place, that Tier 1 or universal instruction and Tier 2 before we start with Tier 3 or really narrowing in to more specific DVI. We're continuing to progress monitor. You can see the little progress monitoring tab next. That means that we're following up on a regular basis, a frequent basis with these students using efficient, easy to implement behavioral and academic progress measures. Gail later in particular will talk about some of the measures that we have available for behavioral progress monitoring, and I'd encourage you to take a look at some of the tools charts on the NCII website to help get a better sense of those academic and behavioral progress monitoring tools. If a student, displays responsiveness or the program is working well, we continue to progress monitor and follow up and make sure that continues to work well. If a student is not responsive, we move down to the next step, which is actually looking at more diagnostic information for a student, either in behavior or academics. On the behavioral side, that might include a functional assessment or a brief functional assessment, and we use that information to help us tailor intervention. The intervention that we are currently using may not be working for that student, and so we may need to modify that intervention. You'll find lots of tools on the NCII website for how to go in and narrow in and really adapt intervention. And then we continue that cycle of progress monitoring to make sure that that particular intervention continues to work. And by work, I mean a student is responding and making growth toward long-range goals in response to what's being provided, either in academics or in behavior. So some of you may be thinking as I'm speaking that this sounds similar to what you would think of as RTI, response to intervention. It may be similar to some of your training in special education, or you might call it PBIS, positive behavior intervention supports, or multi-tiered systems of support. Really, we're thinking about, on the one hand, and let me say, they have similar characteristics. On the one hand, on the left, when we think about tiered levels of support, we have supports that are provided at a variety of levels. So I mentioned before, we have supports and we're monitoring the progress or screening students at the Tier 1 or universal level, at Tier 2 or secondary level, and at Tier 3. We're using progress monitoring data to help teams make better decisions about students. On the special education side, and perhaps narrowing into a more intensive intervention side, that intervention that we're providing is much more individualized. So it's not that we're not concerned about those students who might be struggling at Tier 1, but on this special education side, on the DVI side, we're particularly focused on those students who have the greatest difficulty. The team-based decisions that occur actually may be a special education teacher and grade level teachers who are working with that student. At middle and high school, it might be a team of teachers who work and serve that student. But the team may not be quite as broad as would be in this sort of more school-wide model that's on the left. And so many of these components you'll continue to see throughout, and it should sound familiar to you if you're implementing PBIS or RTI, but the difference is really the intense focus on the particular needs of a child. So if you're used to providing intervention that's what we would call a standard treatment protocol, so many students get the same thing. The way that DVI differs is that we're really customizing or tailoring intervention for particular students, and that can be either in behavior or academics. So I'm going to move on now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty on my end advancing slides, so I can predict to you what's going to happen next. I don't know on your side, Nick, if you can give me a hand with advancing, because it's not working on my end. And so I'm going to talk next a little bit about the intersection of behavior and academics. It's important that we start thinking about those pieces and how they intersect. I think as we, again, as many of you are considering students that you have right now and how those students, it's sort of a cycle, I guess, of thinking about, is it the behavior that's causing academic difficulties? Is it the academics that's resulting in difficulties in behavior? And so we want to keep thinking about the intersection. I think for a long time, many teachers would say, we've known about that intersection, but it's been I think a slightly slow to catch up in the literature and the research about how those two sort of intersect in and how people are monitoring that in the literature. So I apologize again. I'm just having a little bit of difficulty moving forward here. So thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. And if we can just go on to the next one too. Thanks. And we may just continue to do that if that's okay. So we know that students with disabilities, just to sort of characterize what we do know from the literature, we know that students with disabilities definitely many times have low academic achievement, and we know unfortunately that the dropout rates for these students can be much higher than we would have predicted for students without disabilities. In fact, many of you who are at the secondary level, you may feel like you're in your own program of prevention for these students, and that prevention is preventing students from dropping out. And so your goal may be to get them to school each day, to engage them. And so a program of data-based individualization can really help these students be more successful. We also know, unfortunately, that if this cycle continues, we continue to see high arrest rates and incarceration for students with disabilities. And we really want to try to stop that cycle, because following that, the results are not necessarily great for those students with respect to, going on and furthering their education or getting jobs. And so we really hope to get in and change the trajectory of this data. And we've got some great examples of schools that have really been able to do that. And so we're trying to promote and foster the models that those schools are using. So just to follow up on this, some additional data. We know that the school completion rate, so with respect to students staying in school, students graduating, students who have emotional and behavioral disorders have a lower rate of school completion. And it's actually lower than all of the other disability categories, with the exception of students who have multiple disabilities or intellectual disabilities. So it's a strong concern, and particularly when you think about, some of our highest categories of disability include students with learning disabilities, students with emotional behavior disorders, students with autism. And so we're seeing really a strong set of data that show that these students with emotional disturbances, if we don't intervene somehow, they're actually not finishing school, which is really concerning. And we also know that those students may, serve in jail time, they may be in juvenile detention more often, and then that leads to greater dropout. So as you consider the context of your own building and how this information plays out in your own building, we really have a difficult set of challenges. I know I'm presenting later this week on integrating academic and behavioral supports in a Common Core era. And some of you may be feeling that pinch as you work to establish Common Core or your own state standards into your schools to make sure that you're working towards high standards and high standards with respect to your incorporation of those standards in your curriculum, in your assessments. Certainly every state has those high stakes accountability, either tests or end of course exams that you're utilizing. And so all of this creates a sort of a net of difficult challenges, and we're just working towards trying to help our students who have difficulties. We're working towards trying to help them be as successful as they possibly can. We want to try to expose them to as many college options and career options as we can. And unfortunately, problem behavior continues to be one of the primary reasons why these students are excluded from school, from community and work, and it disrupts what could be a really positive cycle of them learning and growing as professionals. And so we want to continue to think about how we can integrate those social and academic systems in schools to create more success. And I think that some of you have done this really successfully in your states. You may call it multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS. You may call it RTI or PBIS. But in schools where those features or those frameworks are in place, students are definitely seeing more signs of success or really feeling more supported in both of those areas. So when we think more about this integrated relationship between the two, this is back to that sort of chicken and the egg cycle, if you will, that I spoke about earlier. It's complicated because it could be that students have a skill deficit. They do something to remove themselves from the classroom. So they put into place some type of avoidance behavior. So I don't like to do math, I'm not feeling very successful at math, and so at math time, when the paper's passed out, when the assignment's given, instead of getting started or asking for help, I crumple up my paper, I start, rocking my desk. That behavior, it sometimes works that behavior actually gets me removed from the class, it gets me moved to a different place, it gets me out of starting that task right away. And so for some students, they've learned this system very well. They know how to get out of that task. And so when we remove them from that task, now they're not only fostering their challenging behavior, but they're also not achieving academically. They're not practicing those tasks that will help them get better academically. In sort of an opposite fashion or a separate cycle, we may have students who have significant behavioral needs. As they exhibit these challenging behaviors, it's not possible to have them working on the same assignments during that time. And so the more behavior that they exhibit, the less time we have to actually work on their academic pieces, which leads to low academic success. And so we need to think about how to jump in and stop this cycle. And many times, and I think the NCII's focus on this DVI process has really helped bring this home for me. Oftentimes, going in and disrupting the cycle for one area and strengthening one area also strengthens the other area. And I hope you've seen that in your classrooms as well and with teachers that for whom you work. Because when we work on, for instance, strengthening a school a school's reading system to help more of their struggling readers be successful, we start to see those students more engaged. And when they're more engaged and they're coming to school more often and feeling that success, we're not going to see as many behavioral outbursts and challenging behaviors. Also, I think as teachers, you feel like you're taking ownership or responsibility of the success, and it makes you even more engaged in helping those students in both academics and behavior along the way. So we know, as I mentioned before, that there are a portion of students who don't respond to what we would consider generally effective intervention. We do know that it's 3 to 5% approximately of all students, but it may be as much as 20% of students at risk. And so again, you know, you may have interventions that have worked really well in the past for a large group of students and those may not work for particular students with whom you're working with now. And so we want to continue to think about specialized programming for this group of students who's exhibiting these sort of unique difficulties. Let's see, and I've talked a little bit about this, but it's really important to note that it's, again, sort of an approach that's comprised of you selecting and tailoring or customizing an intervention program, if you will, that you're following up and collecting data on that particular intervention program, and and this I feel like is maybe the most important piece, that teachers and teams are going back and actually looking at and using that data to make better decisions about what's working or not working for a particular student. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. She's going to talk a little bit about some case studies that have been collected on this approach of sort of integrating behavior and academic supports, and I'll just turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you, Dr. Lembke. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, it moved. I'm not sure if it was me. Hello. I would like to say first that while today I am the one speaking, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to publicly acknowledge that there was a team of educators behind the case study that I'm about to share with you. In addition, a very supportive school district and the National Center's support, including our provider, Terry Marks. So to all of these folks, I express a thank you. A little bit about our context. This case study comes from a middle school implementing data-based individualization for a behavioral need within a Tier 3 math intervention, so an academic intervention. This intervention is a second block of math instruction in addition to these students' grade level Common Core aligned math class. We also have regularly scheduled data meetings to complete the DVI process, as you will see in the following case study. In the registration questions, I noted that some of you, several of you actually, asked about how academics and behavior are integrated, as well as one person asked about interventions for secondary students. As someone who specializes in working with secondary schools around interventions, I can say this for certain. Academic interventions in middle school and high school that don't embed behavioral and motivational components will likely not be very successful. By that level, middle and high school students, sort of as Dr. Lembke was just alluding to that cycle, middle and high school students have experienced year upon year of failure, feeling like it's them, like they can't do it or there's something wrong with them. They start using behaviors like checking out or getting sitting out of class as sort of like defense mechanisms. We, the adults, know that these are incorrect and that this is perpetuating the cycle, but for these students, these behaviors, they're survival. So for this particular group of math interventionists at the case study I'm sharing here today, their first day of training, which we're going to share the online tutorial, a link to an online tutorial of their training, they spent their entire first day of training on understanding struggling learners, specifically to address issues such as learned helplessness anxiety, avoidance, addressing motivation using a growth mindset, and ensuring that we explicitly teach, prompt, and reinforce social and academic behaviors to increase the likelihood that they'll actually take hold of the academic intervention and learn. So I'll say that again, they did no math at all on the first day of math intervention training. At the link that the National Center will share, I'm not sure if they're going to share it in the chat box, it's also in a folder with your handouts and your PowerPoint up there in where it says handouts. There'll be a link, and the first few screencasts on this link will show how that training was embedding behavior and motivation for the math interventionists. And I can't click at the moment, so let's... Nick, it's not working. If you could, thank you. So okay, so right now on your screen you're seeing the online tutorial. If you follow the link, again, it's not the full training because we can't put that online. It would be too challenging. But for each screencast, it's basically a day of our training. And if you scroll down a little bit, you can see that the first training is around student motivation. It's all aligned to the IES practice guide. If you scroll down, it's around student motivation is the first set, including the growth mindset. And then the next set is making sure that you have a highly structured classroom, which is basically PBIS, how to make sure that you're setting your classroom up for the most success you can get for at-risk learners. Addressing motivation, effects of praise using the growth mindset. Great video if you haven't used it. If your school isn't working on those aspects, the teachers really report back great feedback. The highly structured class, and you can see I've got a lot of resources below that come from the National Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. So particularly for secondary teachers, who, if any of you are secondary, as I am, you know that our pre-service training involved borderline nothing, at least mine didn't, very, very little on classroom management and behavioral supports. And so for my math interventionists, along with my general education math teachers, the very first and most critical piece for us to talk about are these components. Because if we can't forge a relationship with our students who are at risk, who have built walls, who are disengaged as a defense mechanism, we're never going to get those walls down, and we're never going to create an environment where they're willing to take a chance and try on something that they've been already shown to be failing at year after year. So again, take a look at these resources. They're here for public use. My teachers are continually giving me feedback on them, and we try to make them better and better every year. In fact, we'll have another one coming soon, year's work, but I don't have that available at this time. And I think we can go back to the presentation. Thank you. Great. Okay, before each data team meeting, so we're in this middle school, we've got students in a Tier 3 intervention, they're all doing pretty well, we're watching the data. We're going to have a data team meeting. Before the data team meeting, we know that there's a student or two that will be on our agenda because their progress monitoring trend line is below the goal or showing other signs of trouble. Each team member knows their role, and we follow the NCII initial meeting protocols, as seen here on the agenda, top right. Because of this, each person knows what to bring, and during the meeting, the facilitator will keep us on time and focused as the initial meeting notes, which are shown here on the bottom, are taken and projected as the meeting takes place by the formal note taker. We will begin with introductions and purpose. We are meeting today to review this student and analyze his or her data to select evidence-based strategies to intensify his or her intervention and to plan for how to evaluate whether or not it works. Thank you. The next step in the NCII protocols is to describe the intervention. Again, this is the document projected. Describe the intervention, the student, and share the data. This step will take no more than 5 minutes. Again, we projected the notes taken during the meeting as it shows here, and this particular intervention is SRA corrective math. It occurs once daily for one full period, 50 minutes, as a Tier 3 intervention. It is a small group that is progress monitored using STAR bi-weekly. I'm sorry, it was weekly, excuse me. The goal is set, and it's ambitious, striving to get this student from to the 25th percentile from the 10th by the end of the school year. This interventionist then shares the student's progress monitoring graph. This student has been on track to meet his goal or her goal, as the goal is represented by the star, and each blue diamond represents a progress monitoring data point. The trend line in black continues to put the student on track to meeting the goal, but the interventionist notes that in the last 6 to 8 data points, the student seems to have a flattening trend. The interventionist added this student to the team agenda because he or she was concerned that if we didn't intensify proactively, this student would soon be off track from making his or her goal within a few weeks here. So we begin by asking, what's the problem? What's causing this flattening trend of a student that was previously making great gains? Other data is shared that is integral to this problem-solving process. And these data points may include things like mastery measures, including here, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, there's math fluency reports, where the student was previously growing, but likewise seems to be flattening a bit. And then below, the SRA mastery tests, again, show inconsistencies, often dramatic. 0 on one test, 100 on another, while the teacher notes that his work in class and his work samples demonstrate that the student does, in fact, get the concepts. During the next 5 minutes, the team is going to ask clarifying questions to drill down and create a hypothesis as to what this student's needs are. First, as always, we consider fidelity. Has the intervention occurred as it should? The administrator on the team notes that student attendance has been consistent, and the interventionist adds that the student always completes all intervention components. There have been 2 fidelity monitoring of the intervention by the coach, as well as confirming that the intervention, there's been 2 fidelity monitoring assessments confirming that the interventionist is following the program as intended. Next, we're going to consider the academic skill gaps, or whether or not this intervention is a good instructional fit. The interventionist has already shared that the student gets it in work samples and in classroom work. So our team is going to then ask, is that inconsistent data, the 100 on one day, 0 on another, etc., may that be indicative of more like emotional or behavioral aspects, such as this is an academic won't do rather than a can't do. The interventionist adds that this student regularly has conflicts before class with a particular individual, an adult, and that he or she does have trouble letting go when upset to be able to focus on classwork. This teacher shares that she can immediately tell if the student enters the class triggered. The student can also be distractible. You can see here that considering behavior and social emotional aspects is critical. The hypothesis our team established was this. This student's lack of progress in the academic intervention, math, is due to emotional or behavioral needs. The student can't focus on math when upset or triggered, and there are regularly occurring issues just before class. Again, following the DVI protocols, we brainstormed and then rated evidence-based intensification strategies, including these. One was move the fluency assessment to later in the class, as this is an additional trigger for this student. Another is switch the student's first period class, where he is often triggered, another antecedent modification. A third one is to check in with the already existing emotional and social skills supports. And another one after that is explicitly teach the student a self-regulation strategy. We suggested the incredible 5-point scale. Finally, the team notes that if the 5-point scale is effective, we have to be sure to bring this information on what works back to his IEP team to see if this strategy could be used more broadly as a behavioral support or intervention plan across his all 7 classes. A registration question asked about how do we help students transfer their learning within an intervention into the classroom. And I hope you can see in this example that we are already thinking about communication and the planning needed to do this. We see generalization as a communication issue primarily, and one that needs to be proactively planned for, clearly defined for whom, by whom, and for when. The team then worked together, each had roles to support the student and the interventionist with carrying this out, to modify antecedents while also a self-regulation strategy using the incredible 5-point scale would be taught. Progress monitoring would continue to be STAR math because we hypothesized that by addressing these emotional needs, this would again allow this student to focus on the math and regain his previous upward trend. This student was then put on the data team agenda to revisit in 5 weeks at a progress monitoring meeting. Communication roles were documented, again, to support generalization. Because the incredible 5-point scale was new to this interventionist, the team roles included that somebody else was going to create the tool from a template, design a lesson plan, and coach the interventionist in its use. Many of you, upon registering, asked where to find such resources, so the resources we used included a book on the incredible 5-point scale that can be found at 5pointscale.com, 5 as in the number 5, and the Autism Internet modules through O'Calley, where in addition to many evidence-based behavioral and academic practices, there is a module dedicated entirely to the incredible 5-point scale. And this module, which requires only a free login to access, includes templates, a stress scale example, and visual prompts, among other resources. This link that I'm speaking of to the Autism Internet modules on the O'Calley website is again in your handouts. There's a folder that says links. Great resources can be found there. So in the end, how did it turn out? To avoid stigmatizing the student with a strategy that only he or she would employ, the interventionist decided that all students in the class could benefit from the incredible 5-point scale, and the interventionist taught it within the small group intervention. It was very well received, and now within the intervention, they, saying, "I'm a 1 and I'm ready to learn," or, "Oh, miss, I'm a 5 today," that can be heard as common classroom language. In addition, it was a great suggestion from our NCII colleagues that the self-ratings can be tracked as data to cross-reference with the math progress monitoring and mastery data. Just another way for us to validate if our hypothesis, when students are not progressing, is a true behavioral root cause. And I guess on a side note, this student did once again resume a general upward trend. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Nicole. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. We're really excited to have all of you here joining us today. My name is Gail, and I'm going to be taking you through some of the behavior resources that we have to support implementation. So my plan is to take the next 20 to 30 minutes to share with you some of the great resources that we have developed to support implementation and specifically focus on the resources around behavior. It's beyond the scope of today's webinar to go into great depth and detail with all of our resources, so please bear in mind that this will be an overview to give you a flavor of what is available to you to use and to access. So where possible, we will provide links and information about the resources. So let's get started, and let's hope that I have control. There we go. This is the homepage of the NCII website. You will see the link to the page at the bottom of the slide. And for those of you who have not had a chance to visit, we do encourage you to go there when you get a chance. So the website is www.intensiveintervention.org. We have also just recently recorded a web tour that is brief and informative, and we will be posting that to our website soon in the event that you are interested in learning more about the website and how to navigate through the different sections. Okay, so one of the resources that we have available are webinars. If you hover over the resources tab on the website, on the homepage, an option for webinars is available in the drop-down menu, and we have also provided a link to the webinars on the slide. So when you go to the webinar page, you can view archived webinars, and you can also see announcements for upcoming webinars.
we've listed a few of the behavior-specific webinars that might be of interest to you, and some of the topics that include evidence-based interventions, progress monitoring, assessments, and the like. With the webinars, in general, there is a link to the recording. There are transcripts of the webinar available, and also any question and answers that took place. Okay, we also have a series of 8 training modules that are focused on components of DVI for both academics and behavior. Again, the link is at the bottom of the slide, and you can find the modules under the Implementation Support tab, which is the 3rd tab on the home page at the top. So in addition to the academic and behavior modules, we also have a module on readiness and action planning, and also an introduction to DVI. So some of the behavior-specific topics include behavior progress monitoring, which is module number 3, behavioral assessment or functional problem solving, which is module number 6, and designing and delivering intervention for students with behavioral needs, and that's module number 8. So each of the training modules will include the PowerPoint slides, and PowerPoint slides also with speaker notes. There'll also be some suggested activities and coaching guides. So it's really a wealth of information that's available through the training series. Okay, so as we think about all the different resources that are available through the website, 2 questions that we often get asked are, what are some good progress monitoring tools for behavior, and can you recommend some Tier 3 interventions? So we have 4 tools charts currently, 2 for academics and 2 for behavior. Again, the links are on the slide, and from the home page, if you hover over the Tools Chart tab, which is the 2nd one, you will again see a drop-down menu, and you can select the tools chart that you are interested in. So for behavior, we have a tools chart for progress monitoring and one for behavioral interventions. We want to note that NCII doesn't endorse or recommend any specific progress monitoring tool or intervention. Rather, the purpose is to create a space where individuals who are looking for information about certain tools and interventions can find that information in one space. So each of the tools charts will have information about the features of the charts, how to use it, a video tour, information about the rating rubrics, and various other pieces of important information. Now, as a note, the behavioral intervention chart is the newer of the 2 behavioral charts. So if you do decide to go to that site, you will notice that the user guide and the video tour are coming soon. So we do hope to post that in the very near future. Okay, so if we go back to the 2 frequently asked questions we often get around progress monitoring and interventions, we wanted to highlight one of our resources on progress monitoring for behavior, and that is the Direct Behavior Rating, or a DVR. So the DVR is actually part of the larger progress monitoring, behavior progress monitoring module, which is, again, number 3. We also have available an audio PowerPoint, which is a quick overview of the DVR and information specifically on how to use the forms, which we'll take a look at in the next few slides. So you can find the DVR overview under the Resources tab on the home page under Publication and Other Resources. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with the DVR, it is a method for collecting data on student behavior that merges a rating scale approach and direct observation. It is research-based, and we've provided a link to the DVR website on the slide. So it's www.directbehaviorratings.org. The single item scale is the one that really has the most research to date, and it allows the user to rate behavior on a single continuum from 0 to 10. The ratings are anchored by such terms as, never, which can refer to, 0%, sometimes, meaning about 50%, or always around 100% during any given observation period. Now, what's really nice about the form and the completion of it really is that it doesn't require constant recording or attention to paperwork, and it really allows the teacher or the user to instruct and manage freely and also use a research-based method for tracking student behavior. So again, there is the link, and we do recommend that you, if you are interested in the direct behavior rating, to go to the website, as there are various forms and instructions that are available there. Okay, so the DVR forms have 3 general behaviors that are already available for use. So academically engaged behavior, non-disruptive, and respectful behavior. The advantage of having these 3 behaviors on the standard form is that you're able to track the target behavior you've identified for your student, and you can also get a better understanding of broader behaviors that are needed for successful school functioning. So let's go over what some of these behaviors might look like. Okay, so disruptive. So here, disruptive behavior is defined. The behavior is a student action that interrupts a regular school or classroom activity. And then there are also some examples, so getting out of your seat, fidgeting, playing with objects, and so on. What's nice about the form is that instructions are provided that specify the behavior and then also the observation period. So in this particular example, the observation period would be small group science instruction. The teacher has marked a 3 here, and then the interpretation from this and the analysis would be that the teacher has estimated that the student has displayed disruptive behavior 30% of the time. Okay, so similarly, if we look at respectful, again, you'll see that there is the definition there of respectful behavior, compliant and polite behavior in response to adult directions and or peer interactions. Examples are provided, and also non-examples if appropriate. And similar to the disruptive example, the teacher can then place a mark and then provide the interpretation and analysis. So again, the marking of 8 would then be interpreted as the student has displayed respectful behavior for 80% of, and again, the observation period being whole class language arts instruction. So this is just a quick overview, and what we wanted to just highlight really in terms of a few important takeaways for the DVR is that behaviors are clearly defined. There are examples provided in terms of what constitutes the specific behavior, and then all behaviors are also readily measured, and then interpretations for the responses are then clearly stated. So the standard DVR items are really useful for tracking a student on broad indicators of school success. However, with DVI, the DVI process, sometimes tracking of behavior needs to be specific to a specific student. So this is where having clear anchors is very important. So in addition to the standard behaviors form, there is also an option to fill in your own forms. And again, you can find these resources on our website under the module, or else at the direct behaviorratings.org. Okay, so the next 2 slides are just an example, and I won't spend too much time on it, of ways in which you can develop a definition and anchors as needed. So here, if you had a behavior that wasn't aligned to the ones that are on the standard form, you would then provide an operational definition. So in this case, we've used Toby as an example. Toby's aggression is defined as any behavior that involves making contact with others in an attempt to injure or harm. And then the examples, this includes punching, hitting, kicking, spitting, so on and so forth. And then finally, similar to the standard form, you would then have the ratings, and you would use the form in the same way. So again, depending on the observation period, you would use the rating scale in the same way. Okay, so just in summary, we just wanted to emphasize that there are various resources that are available with the DVR. You can see it through the NCII website in terms of the specific training modules. I mentioned that there was also the DVR overview, which is just a shorter version that really focuses on just how to use the form, and of course at the DVR website itself. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, one of the questions that we get asked a fair bit is, what interventions would you recommend? And our intention is not to avoid giving an answer, but DVI really is a framework, and the interventions selected will very much depend on the student's needs and the function of the behavior. So this is a behavior illustration, and is occurring in a school that uses check-in, check-out as a secondary intervention for behavior. So the check-in, check-out card, can also provide progress monitoring data, which is great. The left side of the graphic depicts the intervention progression, and the right side shows how progress monitoring tools may change as the intervention itself changes. So when a student is not responsive to the standard check-in, check-out intervention, the team will then ask, why is this student not responding, and adapt the intervention. If this is not sufficient, the team may then conduct a functional behavior assessment or do some functional problem solving, and then use it to develop an individualized behavior intervention plan. So here is the progression. So the next resource that we would like to highlight today is a set of materials called the Implementing Behavioral Strategies, Considerations, and Sample Resources. This set of behavioral strategies was developed for classroom teachers to use with students who may require academic and/or behavioral support. So these strategies are intended to support teachers working with students with primary academic deficits and challenging behaviors. For students with more intensive behaviors, potential intensification strategies are also included in these guides. So there are a total of 6, and we want to emphasize that they are not Tier 3 specific strategies. Rather, they are strategies intended to support teachers who are working, again, with students who have the primary academic deficits, but also as a result, some potentially challenging behaviors. These are available on the website under the tab Instructional Support and Sample Lessons and Activities in Behavior. They can be downloaded as one full document with all 6 of the strategies or separately. What we really like about these strategies is that they are practical. They each come with a brief description at the beginning, definitions for concepts we use, and then they follow a structure that includes what we hope are helpful pieces of information, such as intensification strategies, examples of what it could look like, implementation procedures, and considerations and additional resources if applicable. And we'll go through some of that in the next few slides. Okay, so I just wanted to note as well that these strategies may be used for more or less intensive levels of support, but it does include strategies for intensification. So the standard information would include things like terminology and definitions that are referred to in the document itself. We really do stress that it's important to review the terminology prior to implementation to make sure that you're on the same page. There we go. So here's just an example of what it would look like. These are all just snapshots. So consequent clause, a clause that identifies specific consequences that will be delivered if students do not meet goals and success criteria. So wherever possible, we want to be clear about what it is that we are talking about, and so we provide a definition whenever possible. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there are a set of 6 behavioral strategies that are currently posted on the website: behavior contracts, point sheets, behavior report card, classroom conversations and participation, intermittent reinforcement using a timer, the You-Me game, and the Yes-No learning skills chart. We continue to develop more and are currently working on some additional strategies around self-management, reinforcement, and motivation strategies. We hope to post those on the website soon, and we'll certainly let all of you know as they are developed. So just to recap, the behavioral strategies and sample resources were developed for classroom teachers to use with students who may require academic and or behavioral support. Key terminology and considerations for implementation are included at the beginning of each document. For students with more intensive behaviors, potential intensification strategies are also included. For each of the strategies, it also includes a description of the purpose and the overview, type of strategy, the behaviors that it addresses, some of the settings in which it would be appropriately used in, required materials, implementation procedures and considerations. Wherever possible, we'll have sample scripts or formats, and again, the potential intensification strategies, and then additional resources, so perhaps links to other websites. So the last few slides that I have here are snapshots of the different sections so that, again, you can get a feel for the different components and what they look like in the documents. So here, it's the implementation considerations and the various samples. So you can see a sample in terms of how you might implement this particular strategy. You can see some of the text on the left about some of the implementation considerations, and that example is for the You-Me chart. And then here, the intensification strategies and the additional resources. So again, it's just a bit of text, and you'll find these standardized across the strategies there. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my section, and I again wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and I will turn things back to Sarah.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you for those of you that asked us a couple of questions. There's a few that I have chatted, or that Amy and I think have chatted back to those of you that brought up some questions that I think are important to bring up to our panelists. So Nicole and Amy, and Nicole and Erica and Gail, if you wouldn't mind, one of the first questions that was brought up had to do with buy-in, particularly for intermediate students. and especially how, if you have any suggestions for getting buy-in for these students who have had years of failure, particularly academic failure, but do you have any suggestions for kind of targeting and cueing in our intermediate and adolescent students?
Well, you know,
Yeah, good, Nicole. That's what I was going to ask you, if you wanted to jump in.
Oh, okay, and it's anybody else can too. I'm sorry, I thought that with the middle example. You know, part of that math work in general, and I would say this for everybody, is the teachers would collaborate with one another. So there were a variety of techniques that, you know, in that first day of math training we addressed. You know, first of all, just generally knowing the characteristics of struggling learners, you know, that they are passive learners, learned helplessness, they now have anxiety about this, be it literacy, be it math, and, you know, they're anxious because they feel like they can't do it, as well as, you know, processing problems and the kinds of things that come with disabilities. First, we wanted to make sure all teachers, you know what those things are, so that they can treat their students in such a way. You know, there are a lot of interventionists or teachers in general that, you know, take this tough love approach, and these kids are, you know, slackers, and, you know, we got to do something different. And so first of all, just making sure that the teacher understands the type of classroom environment, right? And so when students come in, the teachers who have worked with me, they immediately set a frame. You know, frame this class. Okay, so, you know, we're all here because, you know, we struggle in this area, and, you know, we're going to do some team building activities. No one is going to be unsuccessful in this class. We're going to set pro-social norms, such as we're always encouraging one another. You know, we're going to have each other always trying. We're going to help one another. You know, a lot of the students' receptivity has to do with the instructor themselves and whether they sincerely believe all these things and have respect for the students, which most teachers do. I have not had any problems with that. In addition, framing the class. And we, as teachers in this collaboration, this community of practice, we brainstorm ways to build this, be it using a motivational TED Talk or video, be it explicitly infusing the growth mindset into everything we do, even baseline data, and saying to students, you know, this is where you are right now, but we're going to do this assessment again, this progress monitoring, in 2 weeks. What do you think we can do? You think it can go up? And a lot of teachers at first say to me, oh, you know, I'm a little nervous about that. Like, what if they don't go up? Or what if the student, you know, doesn't buy in and doesn't try? I have not seen this happen. You know, middle level, high school level, I'm finding that students rise to the occasion, and the fact that progress monitoring does not count as a grade takes that fear factor out. And then this classroom, which is a positive culture, which you're embedding positive self-talk and you're embedding a growth mindset, all of that together, it takes down walls. Now, does it happen overnight? No. I would say the interventionists that I work with probably say they spend the first couple of weeks on these types of things, and that's why our elementary model that interventions can be done in, say, 12 to 20 weeks or so, whatever you're thinking. In secondary, my interventionists, at a minimum a semester and most often a year. Did that help?
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. I think that helped. Does anybody else want to add anything to that, or I'm happy to kind of go on to a couple of the other questions that we've gotten. One of the other questions was about tracking amplitude of behavior in addition to frequency, and I think this came in during, Gail, when you were talking about the DVR, but again, anyone who wants to talk about this. Someone asked particularly about tracking the amplitude of behavior in addition to frequency. So, for example, the example that they gave was punching a student is obviously a bigger infraction than getting a drink at the inappropriate time. So is there a way to, in addition to tracking frequency, also keeping track of amplitude?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really great about the forms themselves, especially the fill-in the behavior, is that you can then, the form itself is flexible enough that it allows for you to define what it is that you're specifically targeting, the behavior that you're looking at. So I think absolutely there is that ability to record that and specify what it is that you're looking for. So again, as you mentioned in that example, perhaps the drinking the water might be more suited as an example for the standard behaviors, whereas you can use the fill-in one to ensure that you're capturing the intensity of that specific behavior.
Great, thank you. Other questions that you have? It looks like we've been able to address some of them. A number of questions that have come in have asked specifically about programs or resources, and I'd like to reiterate again that we don't, at the National Center on Intensive Intervention, we don't generally promote a specific program or a specific resource, but we would like to point you in the direction of the tools charts. And I think Amy sent out a message earlier saying that there are a new version of the tools charts that are coming out, I think towards the beginning or sometime in October. But in addition to that, the current tools charts the tools charts in their current form are on our website, which is intensiveintervention.org, which is a great place for you to go to look at resources for both academics, progress monitoring, intervention, those sorts of things. So I'd like to direct you there. It also looks like we had a question about families. If there's resources for families or strategies for helping families to be partners in the process of integrating academics and behavior. Do any of you as panelists have suggestions or ideas about how that could happen?
Well,
so this is Erica.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This is Erica. I'll just jump in real quick. There are a couple of resources, and I believe they're on the RTI network site. So if you go to RTI network and then enter a search for parents and RTI, there are some nice sort of manuals or little go-tos for how to help parents understand what's happening. It's pretty, it's a little more specific to RTI, but the same thing, you can go to the PBIS website, which is just pbis.org, and they have manuals there as well to help support parents. So those might be a couple of places to check out.
This is Nicole, who did the case study. I was just going to say that if I can see how to share things with folks, I don't know if I could just do it to the organizers. Parent involvement for my work, this math intensive intervention, is our current goal for the year. And because of that we're trying to do a better job with that, we have some parent engagement sort of tools and supports that we've been making. They're all in the alpha, version, so please know that these are just drafts and we're currently using them in schools, but I can share them right now in the chat. I'm sending them to the organizers. They're basically video toolkits. So a lot of the problems that we were having around parent engagement and intensive intervention is a lot of parent misunderstanding. We're not doing a very good job of explaining to parents the why behind what we're doing and sort of like the data piece. Teachers were very concerned about, okay, the parent's comfortable with me having this intensive intervention, but I know I'm supposed to share the progress monitoring data with them, and I'm not really very comfortable with that because they won't understand it, and I'm worried about how they'll take that. So the tutorials, which we created with parent and teacher input, are little video screencasts where we basically explain the why behind things, the why behind progress monitoring, and then the next tutorial says, this is how you explain to a parent a progress monitoring graph. Now, you can use these videos in a Meet the Teacher night. You can use them via email when somebody emails you a question. There's a variety of ways that they can be utilized, and sometimes even the teachers say, I just want them because I want to understand in more layman's terms what I'm doing, and so far we've gotten pretty good reviews on them. I see that the right website is up, but it's for the math work, not for the tutorials. Oh, it's coming, okay. And I know this isn't a perfect solution to your question. I hope if you check back by the end of next year, I'm going to have much better parent tools and parent engagement tools, but this is the best I have at this point. So you can see this is a screencast on the why behind progress monitoring, and we really strove to use no jargon. Like, I really tried to connect to metaphors in people's everyday lives, not use things like RTI because they don't get what that means, or MTSS. So here's the why. It's probably a 7-minute video, and if you scroll down, another like 5-minute video, I'm not sure exact time, is how do you read your progress monitoring graph. Now, the schools in this pilot happen to be using the same progress monitoring tool, but I do think that the video itself, its concept is generic enough that you could use it in a variety of ways. And then the bottom part is a sample letter, progress monitoring letter, to send home with the graph that comes from Tennessee's Department of Education, adapted with permissions for the basically saying to the parent, okay, here's where we are, your child's making good progress, and we'll continue to be in this intervention, and you just attach the graph to it. So hopefully that's helpful.
Awesome, thank you. And Erica, did you mention something about an additional presentation on integrating behavior and academics in the Common Core at the beginning of this? That there was an additional presentation, or that you were doing a presentation in the future on that? So we had a question asking specifically about that, accessing that presentation. And I was curious if we could get information about where that is, or
Sure.
When that
so I'm doing that presentation for the Council for Children with Behavior Disorders, the CCBD conference, tomorrow, actually, in Atlanta. And I think that it would be fine for me to share those slides with you all. And Sarah, you'll just have to tell me what the best way is to share those. I don't have this awesome link like Nicole has, and so I'm not quite sure how to share them, but I'd be happy to do that.
Okay. That sounds good. We can try to coordinate a way to get that information disseminated potentially.
Great.
In addition, and I didn't mention this, and I failed to mention this earlier, but NCII is also working on putting together some parent resources later in the year. So those will be posted on the website, and we've sent the website link to many of you. But just be on the lookout for those additional resources to what Nicole shared, because we know that that's a big part of this work and an important part of this work. So we're in the development process of doing that as well. We did have one more. I think we have time for a couple more questions. We did have someone asked about making sure that that you remain objective, like objectivity and subjectivity within rating on the DVR. Do any of you have suggestions about how to do that when you're rating potentially your own kids or your kids that you know have had behavior issues in your own class for a long period of time? I know that that might be a problem, or maybe something that teachers struggle with a little bit. Do any of you have some suggestions around that issue?
So this is Erica. I'm the academic expert commenting on behavior, so that's going to get me in trouble. But if you are concerned about it, and I think objectivity on those sorts of things is paramount, you might actually have one of your colleagues come in and co-rate with you for a little bit. Like if I was a new teacher or new to a building, or if it was the start of the year, I might have a co-teacher come in and co-rate with me, even if it was like for 10 minutes, you know, like have one of the student teachers in the building cover a class for 10 minutes and have that person come over and co-rate just to see how reliable you are. I actually encourage buildings to do that, even on their, you know, something that really is simple like a CBM progress monitoring where you're collecting number of words correct. I would encourage some reliability checks on that. So that's just one quick way that you might check on whether, you know, sort of the objectivity.
Hi, this is Gail. I think that's a great suggestion, Erica. And also, to add on to that, I think really ensuring that the definitions and the examples that you use are very clear and defined and measurable are also a great way to keep that objectivity there as well.
We just got a question about asking how the DVR is different from an FBA. Can one of you maybe briefly talk through just kind of the difference?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. Gail may have more detailed information, but basically the DVR is a quick pulse check, kind of like a blood pressure check. So if you are used to using CBM measures, curriculum-based measurement in academics, like the STAR measure that Nicole talked about, or some type of oral reading fluency, this is the counterpart in behavior. It's not meant to give you detailed diagnostics. So an FBA, in my opinion, would be used once you determine that there might be a more significant problem. You could go back in and analyze, collect that FBA data, and then look at it to determine how to tailor or customize your intervention. And then you might monitor the progress of the success of that behavioral intervention with DVR data.
I think that's a great summary, Erica. And there's also some additional information available on the modules on the website. There are many different resources that you can use that will give you a bit more information on how to do a functional behavior assessment or to do some of that functional problem solving. So there are several different steps involved, and we have lots of resources and handouts that provide guidelines for that, and similar with the DVR. So I think that there's a lot of information that's available that will be helpful.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? It looks like we've addressed most of what has come in. I do want to let you know that we will do our best to get to those questions that did come in for those of you that submitted questions when you registered for the webinar. Those will be posted at some point on the website after we've been able to get answers to those questions that came in. And the webinar itself will also be posted on the website in that spot. Gail showed you under the resources where the webinars are posted, and that's under intensiveintervention.org. So this webinar will be there with any of the handouts or the information that pertains to this webinar. It looks like our questions have slowed down, so I think with about 6 minutes to spare, we can go ahead and feel confident that we are good to bring this webinar to a close. I'd really like to thank Dr. Lembke and Dr. Chan and Nicole Bucka for joining us today and presenting their wealth of information on academics and behavior. Thank you for joining us and asking your questions and turning this into a discussion at the end. I appreciate how interactive you were. There were a lot of you on the line with us, so thank you for taking some time out of your day today to join us. I hope you have a really good rest of your day. If you go to our website, you're able to sign up for our newsletter if you'd like to get our information and hear kind of the materials and the things that are coming out for us. That's at intensiveintervention.org. You're also able to see all of our new resources and those sorts of things. So that being said, thank you so much and have a really great rest of your day.